this is my most requested video ever, actually, and also one of the scariest videos I've ever made. So hello, welcome, thank you for coming, glad to have you here. If you're new here, hi, my name is Sydney, my pronouns are they, them. I'm an openly queer, disabled, autistic, and trans, non-binary actor, composer, educator, disability advocate, and media analyst. Also, I am a white person with light brown shoulder-length curly hair wearing a black t-shirt that says the future is accessible on it, but you can't see that because of the framing. And I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. I make videos about all kinds of things ranging from theater to psychology to disability to education. I also directed and played Christopher Boone in the first all-neurodivergent cast and crew production of Curious Incident, so I have a very unique knowledge of accessible theater and theatrical representation, particularly within the realm of neurodivergence, and I've gotten maybe 150 DMs and emails and messages everywhere since Ohio's Broadway announcement in July requesting I make a video talking about the show. I responded to none of them because, in all honesty, this show has been scaring the absolute heck out of me since I learned about it in 2021, but we're gonna talk about that today. But first, the overarching theme that I want to make sure I get across as clearly as humanly possible. I loved this show. I will be going back to see it again. I just need to figure out when that's gonna be. I also have a very unique knowledge of how deeply impossible the trap of representation is, especially when creating within a space that has never seen the representation before, because no matter what direction you go, you have always messed up something in somebody's eyes, always seemingly forgotten something, always done too much or too little, always slipped into one stereotype or another, because stereotypes exist in binary, so if you avoid it on one side, you hit it on the other. There is literally no way to win with this. My critiques of this show exist for more of an academic discussion of what comes next than anything else. The majority of the issues within the show are issues solely because this is the only thing in explicitly autistic theater canon to exist right now outside of Curious, and they can only be fixed via having more and different kinds of representation. I will also add that disability rights and language, particularly on the neurodivergence and madness side of disability, have been changing very, very rapidly over the last few years due to the boom in diagnosing over the pandemic, which also includes our knowledge of and attention to various tropes. So putting all of that into a musical, which usually take about 10 years from the beginning to Broadway, very scary. And again, they were fighting an uphill battle from day one. Also, side note, the rise in diagnoses for all mental illnesses over the pandemic is because the DSM is structured so that the symptom and trait checklists for various disorders are centered around signs of distress, which increased over the pandemic as everybody was trying to cope with the trauma of the pandemic. So society is not necessarily more neurodivergent now than we were before. We're just suddenly all fitting the criteria as they are currently written. But I'm not here to rant about the DSM. I've already done that in a few videos. I'll link one above for you. All of this is to say, they killed it with the show, and this video will probably seem fairly critique heavy, but that is for the purposes of academic discussion and academic discussion alone, because this show is a heck of a good foot in the door for accessible theater, and we need to get all hands on deck to help continue to push that door open, which can only happen via discussions like this one. Now, the reason I have yet to speak about this show, despite the gazillion messages about it that I have received over the summer, is because I'm really, really bad at masking my feelings about things, and I didn't want my preemptive disappointment and terror about the show as a creator with a decent sized platform to at all impact the show in any way, because it is a new musical which tend to struggle more on Broadway just due to capitalism, and is also going to be automatically contentious because it is breaking barriers. So I decided to not give any public opinions until I had seen the show and could make a thorough and well-rounded opinion on it in either direction. I was trying to be an optimist about it, but in case you didn't know, disability representation history is really, really bad, and it's also worse in theater. So I need you to believe me when I tell you that I have never been more stressed watching a show. I was shaking from the moment I got on the subway to the moment I got home after the show. The reviews from early previews were really great, but that's what happened with Kimberly Akimbo too, and I went to see that as a disabled person and left feeling fully violated, so my hopes for the show were not high. And much like my experience with Paper Mills Gatsby, this show had a lot of baggage for me going into it, and I spent the whole thing waiting for something to go wrong. And that, if anything, should make my positive review of this be even more valuable. Now, the other thing that I want to say before we jump into it, sorry, there's a lot of like caveats for this video. Over the course of the last few months of just being a disabled person in this industry, I've befriended a lot of the folks that are working on this show. They are some of the kindest, smartest, most wonderful people ever, and I thought about inviting them to be interviewed for this video. Some of them even offered, but ultimately I knew that if I did that, it might make you as an audience feel like my thoughts were less genuine or somewhat softened since they were involved, and I did not want to do that, nor do I want to implicate them in whatever weird hot takes I may have in this video. That being said, I did ask a million questions. They helped fill in some gaps of understanding I had about pieces of the show for me, and they did somewhat help me formulate some of my ideas with the further knowledge about the show that they have that I do not. So I do want to shout them out and thank them for that. You're all very much appreciated. So you're gonna get some behind the scenes content in this video, yes. Also, in the realm of shouting people out, I was commissioned to write a review for 3 Views on Theater. I will link that at the top of the description. You should definitely go check it out. The tickets they gave me were in the 5th row, which was just wild. Anyway, I'm gonna play my video of bows here so that you can see 7 autistic adults kicking butt, and then let's get into it. For a brief historical overview, How to Dance in Ohio began as a Peabody Award-winning documentary. I don't know if it's Peabody or Peabody. Anyway, they won the award. It's a documentary by Alexandra Shuva in 2015. You can now watch that documentary on Max, so in all honesty, I would not recommend it. We'll get into that in a bit. The legendary director Hal Prince began working on a musical adaptation of it in honor of his autistic granddaughter. The earliest records I found of the show are from 2 2018 interviews, one with The Guardian, the other with Playbill. I'm pretty sure the show was already very much in the works before then. I don't know how old it was at this point, but the documentary came out in 2015, so it can only have been so old. Prince unfortunately passed away in 2019, at which point Sammy Cannell took over as director. This is her Broadway debut, by the way. There are so many Broadway debuts in the show, which is just wonderful. Anyway, there was a 29-hour reading of the show in October 2021 in New York City, followed by a June 2022 workshop, a premiere at Syracuse Stage in September 2022, a workshop in February of 2023, and then in July of this year they announced the show was coming to Broadway, where it opened on December 10th at the Belasco. Also, we're gonna clear up some misconceptions throughout this video, but the first one right off the bat is that I've seen some stuff talking about how this is an all autistic or all neurodivergent team. That is very much not the case. Much of the team is openly autistic and much more of the team is openly neurodivergent, but it is not entirely either of those things. It is a neurodiverse team, meaning that there are neurotypical people and neurodivergent people, but it is not all neurodivergent. A deliberately all autistic cast and crew has never happened for any show as far as I know, and a deliberately all neurodivergent cast and crew production has never happened as far as I know outside of my production of Curious. And I'm not saying that to be like, oh my gosh, I did that, but like, we have an issue in the industry and we need to be doing more of that. I will also add that this is the first time we have ever had openly autistic actors on Broadway. We've also never had any on a national tour in the US, a UK national tour, or on the West End as far as we know. Autistic actors have most certainly done both, but may not be out or even diagnosed, a primary example being Sir Anthony Hopkins, who was on Broadway in Equus decades before his diagnosis. And the only time that we have had an explicitly autistic character in the theater canon was Christopher in Curious Incident in 2013 in the UK and 2014 in the US, though the word autism is never used in the show. And before anybody goes complaining about how that's erasure or whatever, there is dramaturgical reason as to why that is the case, which I actually firmly agree with, so you can learn about the history of Curious up here. I'm trying to cut down how many tangents I go on in each video. We're gonna see how that goes. Also, I anticipate running out of cards because I'm mentioning a lot of other things from this video, so everything I talk about will also be linked in the description for you. How to Dance in Ohio, the original documentary as described by HBO, charts the challenges and triumphs of a group of teens and young adults from Columbus, Ohio, all of whom are living on the autism spectrum as they prepare for their first spring formal dance. It specifically focuses on 3 young women, Caroline, Jessica, and Meredith. The musical, as described by Ohio's Sensory Guide, is based on a true story about 7 autistic young adults at a group counseling center in Columbus, Ohio, who are preparing for a spring formal dance. The show begins with the 7 autistic characters coming on stage to tell you a little bit about what you can expect from the show. The YouTube channel B-Way Show has it filmed on there, so I'm gonna play that for you here.
I'm gonna do a show for you. There's music in it. Woo! And dancing, of course.
There is no audience participation. Introverts, you're safe.
This show is based on things that actually happened, but parts have been embellished for dramatic purposes. You have to spice things up in Ohio.
There is this saying, if you've met one autistic person, you have met one autistic person. Woo! You are now meeting 7 autistic people!
I love
go now. For anyone who needs them, we have cool-down spaces available in the left mezzanine and the lower lounge. We also have sensory bags available to borrow from the merch stand, which contain some fidget toys and some glasses, should it get too bright in here.
Isn't it nice to know what's going on?
Yeah!
Yes, it is. Silence your devices. We are going to start the show now.
In that clip, from left to right, we have Remy, any pronouns, Jessica, she, her, Mel, they, them, Drew, he, him, Meredith, she, her, Tommy, he, him, and Caroline, she, her. They each are primarily focusing on certain things throughout the show, so Remy is starting a cosplay channel, Jessica's working to be more independent so she can move out of her mother's house, Mel is trying to get a promotion at the pet store that they work at, Drew is trying to figure out what college he wants to go to, Meredith is working on expanding her comfort zone, and Tommy is trying to get his driver's license, and Caroline is navigating her first relationship, which is with a jerk named Jay, who we never actually see. All of them come together at Amigo Family Counseling, a group therapy for autistic young adults run by Dr. Amigo. Amigo also has a daughter named Ashley, who is a dance student at Juilliard, but currently at home recovering from fracturing her ankle and works at the center to keep herself busy. There are some other characters, but those are the main 9. I'm now going to go through a summary of the show. It's not entirely necessary for the wider discussion around the show, but I think it's important, so I'm going to do it anyway. If you want to skip spoilers, that is okay. You will still understand most of the rest of this video. You can skip to this time code, audio description. The time code is
14 minutes and 47 seconds.
I'm going to do the rest of the summary via the one my friend Nicole D'Angelo, the assistant music director and script consultant on the show, wrote on Reddit a few weeks ago, because I have a copy of the script, but I feel like Nicole knows the show better than I do. So all the rest of the summary is going to be a direct quotation from her. Great, here we go. In Act 1, we see Drew feeling like he only wants to attend the University of Michigan to make his parents happy. He later announces that he will be attending Ohio State. Meredith info dumps about Australia at a diner with her father, who is trying to talk to her about the formal. Caroline daydreams about the dance on her way to take a Japanese exam. Ashley expresses that she isn't so sure she wants to go back to Juilliard after her ankle heals. Caroline and Jessica go to Macy's for dresses while their mothers reminisce about their own school dances and express joy that their kids now have the opportunity to attend an accessible dance. Mel has a misunderstanding at work with their manager and becomes overwhelmed, and Drew struggles with the social aspects of asking Meredith to the dance. At the end of Act 1, Drew chickens out when trying to ask Meredith and instead offers her a book. At the top of Act 2, Meredith is reading Drew's book and singing about her newfound romantic feelings towards Drew. Caroline encourages Jessica to ask Tommy to the dance, but when she finally asks him, she finds out he's already going with Mel. Ashley tells her father she wants to quit dancing to work at his center, and he fires her, saying he won't let her use the center as a place to hide instead of fighting for her dreams. Mel overhears this and offers Ashley some words of wisdom. The primary conflict is in Act 2. The therapist Dr. Amigo has agreed to interviews with 2 local reporters. One of the reporters writes an inspiration porn article about the dance, which centers Amigo and completely objectifies and infantilizes the group members. Remy decides he will not attend the dance in protest of the article and instead does his first live stream to improve conversations about disability. One by one, we find out the members are unable to attend the dance. Jessica and Caroline get in a fight over Caroline's toxic boyfriend. Tommy gets his license but crashes his brother's truck and is grounded. Mel gets the promotion at work but has to cover their coworker's shift. Meredith refuses to go, and Amigo believes Drew will not come because of a call that he, Amigo, made to the University of Michigan, lying about Drew wanting to attend there instead of Ohio State. But to Amigo's surprise, Drew shows up and is disappointed that nobody came. Drew has the idea to throw another dance the following day at the therapy center. Amigo apologizes to the group about the article. Caroline and Jessica make up, and she's broken up with her boyfriend, and Meredith's dad convinces her to attend. Ashley unexpectedly shows up at the dance and announces that she is retired as a dancer and sets clear boundaries with her father. Mel encourages Amigo to hire Ashley back with a raise. The second dance is a success, and in the final moments of the show, we see Drew ask Meredith to dance. The lights fade as they make their first physical connection in preparation to dance. My 3 favorite moments, outside of the kick butt performances, were the line Mel has about how they're struggling because they make sub-minimum wage because they're disabled. Thank you for including that. There was also a moment with Mel at work where their boss was effectively tone policing them, telling them that they have a bad attitude and they're being disrespectful and condescending when they're not doing any of the above. They're literally just existing, which happens a lot to autistic folks, but also the fact that Mel is a person of color added to the intersectionality of it all, and it was just so poignant and good and lovely. Also in the scene, I didn't include this in my script, but also in the scene, Mel gets so overwhelmed that they lose speech and then they have to use text-to-speech function to be able to express what they're feeling, and I was so glad that we included that as well. And then my last favorite thing was that the ableist article situation in Act 2 is written so perfectly and beautifully and full of the kind of supposedly complimentary stuff people say about disabled people that are actually deeply, deeply offensive, but we're gonna talk about that a little bit more later in this video as well. So that is our show. It is simple but meaningful and beautifully crafted, and I had a wonderful time once I was done being objectively terrified that something super offensive or outdated was gonna happen. I trust this team of the show. I do. They're all wonderful, but I was still so deeply nervous because things were going too well for too long, and it wasn't statistically possible that it would stay that way. And then it did, and I didn't know how to process that. And then I just cried the whole second act. I just sobbed the whole time. 10 out of 10. Would do it again. Will do it again. Already planning it. But let's dig into the show a little bit. My main critique that I talked about in my review with 3 views was that it didn't center its autistic adults nearly enough. This was something I unfortunately expected going into it, given what happened with Amazon Prime's As We See It like a year ago, where they heavily advertised this groundbreaking TV show following 3 autistic adults in a group home, how it was all about their perspective on life and whatnot. And then the show came out, and maybe 50% of it was about them and their lives, but the rest was about the lives of their caregivers. And also there was that one episode where the parents talked for like 10 minutes about how miserable they were having autistic children, and it was left completely unquestioned in the show. Like, so much for centering autistic adults. What was that? But I think we as a society have come to expect that that's what centered representation actually looks like, even though that's very much not the case at all. This trope where a disabled character exists to prop up a wider narrative about what it means to be human, and therefore without the disabled character or disability, the story and conflict would not exist, but it's in no way central to the actual story itself, is called A Narrative Prosthesis, which is also an incredible book that's a great basis for media studies, specifically with disability. If you want to learn more about that, highly recommend. But this specific subsection of the narrative prosthesis is known as the caregiver or caretaker narrative because it tells the story of those around and related to the disability rather than the story of the disabled person themselves. And these stories are important, these experiences are important, but they are kind of the only representation that we get. So they're annoying. The advertising for Ohio came across very similar to that of As We See It, with some criticisms as to the advertising feeling a bit inspiration word that rhymes with corny, YouTube please don't demonetize me, and infantilizing. Particularly the each small victory can feel gigantic tagline, which felt pointed toward a neurotypical audience's desire for inspiration corn content. By the way, when I refer to the concept of inspiration corn, that is a concept where disabled people are portrayed as being inspirational solely for living our daily lives and getting through our normal challenges, and everybody finds it heartwarming and feels better about themselves because if we can do it, so can they, which is objectifying as hell. But after seeing the show, I understand why their marketing was structured the way that it was, and it makes sense to me, but without that knowledge, I definitely also initially perceived it the same way, which made me even more nervous about the show and more expectant that the adults would not actually be centered in the narrative. Also, for the record, advertising for a show like this is one of those places where no matter what they did, it would have been heavily critiqued, and I don't know what I would propose that they would do differently. Like managing social media for Curious and trying to figure out how we wanted to go about advertising a show but also trying to subvert narratives was one of the most nightmarish parts of that project, if I'm gonna be honest, aside from like the institutionalized ableism and weird social dynamics that ended up canceling it 3 days before it was meant to open. But if we ignore that, marketing and media was one of the hardest parts because I knew that no matter what, people who wanted to infantilize us and see us as inspirational, not in like a, I see myself in them, but in like a derogatory, objectifying way, we're gonna see us that way, and there wasn't really a lot we could do to avoid that without directly trying to subvert it in every piece of media that we put out. But back to this show. They did struggle to center these 7 autistic adults. A huge part of that being because you had to follow and flesh out 7 characters, which is by itself a very difficult task. I saw Harmony a few weeks ago. It had a very similar problem with profiling the 6 harmonists. Though also as a face-blind person, I had a very hard time keeping track of everybody because they all kind of looked the same from a distance and I had a different costume in every single scene. But that was not an issue in the show for several reasons. And some of them were very deliberate on the show's side, but we're gonna get to that later as well. But in addition to trying to tell the story of the 7 autistic characters, we also had Dr. Amigo and his daughter Ashley, and then several of the parents of the autistic people, all of which sort of had the same depth of character across the board. It felt less like a deliberate focus on the caretaker narrative as we saw and As We See It, and a lot more like the show just wasn't 100% positive where the central focus actually was, if that makes sense. Like, yes, some of the moments felt a bit gratuitous for the family members to talk about their struggles with raising their young adults. They were all like positive, we're proud of them, they've come so far, not like this was hard and I hate it things, which is like a low bar to cross. But I I think the primary issue was the unclear focus. After discussing this with some of the members of the team, I now understand that some of this was somewhat deliberate. Many of the extra pieces fleshing out the neurotypical characters were there to point to the fact that lots of things that we pathologize in autistic folks, such as misreading social cues, happen all the time to non-autistic people as well. And the point was to make the lines between allistic and autistic a lot more blurry and make the audience rethink their prejudices a bit, and make the audience also misread social cues themselves and get confused and realize that they've done it as well and they've fallen within the same sections of diagnostic criteria that we, use for different kinds of people. Also, side note to all the reviewers who use neurotypical as an antonym for autistic, allistic or non-autistic are antonyms to autistic. Neurotypical is not. Neurotypical implies that there is no mental disability, which includes like anxiety and depression and PTSD. Those are under the neurodivergent umbrella as well. And also neurodivergent is not a substitute word for autistic. And also please stop saying on the spectrum as a euphemism for autistic. Autism is not a dirty word and we need to be using it. That being said, while I think that it's cool that there was some semblance of blurring the neurotype lines, I think some of those moments and scenes fit easily within the show without question, and others felt like actively weird uses of time, particularly the nightclub situation between Amigo and the reporter. That wasn't in the summary. Basically, there's two reporters. There's a guy reporter who writes the inspiration corn thing, and then there's a pretty lady reporter who wants to cover the dance, and she invites Amigo for an interview at the nightclub the dance is going to take place at the day before the dance, and he assumes it's a date, but it's not a date, and it's really, really, really awkward. I now sort of get why that was there, but they also only had so much stage time to work with to center these 7 autistic adults, most of which they used to teach about autism through the characters rather than teach about the individuals themselves, so they got an even smaller portion of stage time in the sense of like just them being them. Which brings us into the whole trap of minority representation, because when we create minority rep, we expect that some part of the audience is going to be from the minority, but we expect the majority of the audience to be from the majority. And there are two main ways I've seen this issue of target audience handled. The first is what they did with autistic representation in Heartbreak High. In episode 2, Quinny has a whole speech towards another character where she talks about how she's autistic and what that looks like for her and what her needs are. It fits organically into the plot. It mirrors conversations I've had in real life as an autistic person, but it does feel a little bit like, while it's there to explain to the other character what's going on, it's more there to explain to the audience what's going on. And it's also just like a little bit too polished for what we would say in our daily lives. Like sometimes I'm not polished and spot on, but a lot of the times it's just word vomit and it's not that beautiful. The second way that we see this is what they did with trans representation in Our Flag Means Death. In episode 4, the only exposition that we get about Jim as a non-binary person is that they go by Jim, nothing has changed from when they were pretending to be a man, and they're not a fucking mermaid. It's never brought up again. That's it. You learn who Jim is as a person first, and their non-binary identity just happens to exist, but it's not a big deal to other characters. Ohio leaned very heavily into Heartbreak High style of representation, using a lot of the dialogue to teach the audience about what it means to be autistic, while feeling like mostly natural conversations between the characters, which could start a discussion saying like, oh, the show's made for a non-autistic gaze to teach them about us, not for us to see ourselves as reflected on stage, and that was just a happy byproduct. But the thing with representation is that for people new to a minority community, an educational form of representation is actually primarily what they look for as well, because it helps them to solidify their language around the topic and find the words to describe their experiences for the first time. So it's not entirely for non-autistics, it's for non-autistics and new autistics, or autistics who are new to seeing representation of themselves. I also find that disability representation in general almost never takes the Jim route, despite the fact that, just like gender, no one is owed an explanation of somebody's disability, so I didn't really expect to see that kind of representation in the show. But at the same time, now that I've personally grown past the phase of, wow, I need to find rep that perfectly represents me to help me validate my own identity, I want something with more depth and grit and messiness and personality than I want educational content, because I don't really need that anymore. And I think Ohio's teaching was really perfect for what really is our first time explicitly in this industry, but I also really look forward to seeing how things build on this now that we have this foundation, and how we can create autistic representation that is messy and complicated and less palatable. Like, even an Orpheus and an Elphaba are more crunchy and ethically sketchy than what we got with the autistic characters here. Ohio feels like the difference in lesbian representation between Emma in The Prom and Allison in Fun Home, if that makes any sense at all. Again, I think this is fine for what the show is and the place it needs to hold historically, but I am concerned by the fact that people are coming away from the show thinking this is what centering disabled people looks like, because it's not. Though I will say a lot of the reviews from non-disabled folks actually agreed with me on this point, so we might be safe there. We might be all good. The other more important thing though is that having one-dimensional characters is actually going to further the issues and impacts of what I call the freak show effect. Not a good word for it, but it's the best way to describe it. This was my primary concern about the show when it was announced. It is still my primary concern. I've heard rumblings that we're already seeing the effects of this actually, but due to the history of freak shows, which people like to pretend never existed despite the fact that they are more or less the foundation for our theatrical structure today, actors' equity exists because of freak shows. It also very much impacted today's media representation, and our modern theater canon relies on the stories of explicit or coded mad and disabled people for its success. Pretty much every show on Broadway right now has at least one autistic coded character in it. But back to my main point. The majority of people working in freak shows were performers. Yes, they were disabled and their disabilities were on display, but most of them were playing up their disability in performative ways to get more money out of the spectators. I'm gonna put my history of freak shows video up here if you're interested. They still very much exist today, also super fascinating stuff, but people did not know that they were acting and came away from freak shows thinking that they were not performers and they were just on display. And to this day, people have a hard time seeing disabled bodies as being able to act and perform as anything but themselves. And having the first autistics on Broadway playing disabled characters that are fairly one-dimensional, so it comes across as, maybe they're just being themselves in the roles written around them, which it is for every character in every single new show, but the, historical context and meaning of this makes it a little bit more tricky, and this is a problem, and it will very much impact our ability to get cast in mainstream roles, and again, I've heard that it already is. This was already happening with Curious Incident. Playing Christopher is a very difficult and coveted role. When non-autistics are in the role, they often use that as a career launcher. When a disabled person plays the role, everybody assumes it's easy for them because they don't need to act, they're just being themselves, and people are often surprised when I tell them that as an autistic actor, playing an explicitly autistic character is one of the hardest things I have ever done, especially in comparison to playing non-autistic characters. They just assume that all visible autism, especially on stage, is interchangeable, and it's resulting in many autistic folks getting their start in professional theater and getting their equity cards in this role and having a very difficult time getting hired for literally anything else. And this does not mean that they're not talented, it's literally just because of the way that we view disabled people. This also regularly happens with disability in the Glass Menagerie as well. And as amazing as the show is, I fear this phenomenon is only going to get worse because of it. Especially because if you hire me, I will be the first openly autistic actor in a mainstream non-autistic role on Broadway. Does not have the same motivational ring to it as if you hire me, I would be the first openly autistic actor on Broadway for a casting team. And there's also the whole, well, this show is for people like you, so why not just go do that one instead of coming into our show, because we don't want to deal with you thing that we see all the time with disability theater. That was like the majority of my theater education was just that. Another discussion that I think is important to have about the show is the fact that by having Ashley home from Juilliard because she broke her ankle and is waiting for it to heal, they're further presenting autism within an inherently medicalized lens. And having her disability be temporary and fixable frames the social skills therapy as making autism temporary and fixable as well. Dr. Amigo's focus on it seeming kind of medical is not that much of an issue for me actually, because you visibly see a lot of the flaws in his judgment. We'll get to that in a second. And you realize that maybe this therapy is more about conforming than anything else. But then Ashley kind of takes over by the end of the show and reconfigures it to be less like, we're medically teaching compliance to social norms via learning how to pretend to be neurotypical, and more, this is the only way everybody here gets to have human connection, which is almost worse. Social skills therapy, much like ABA, is a complicated and nuanced discussion to begin with because the idea of all of this is bad is not helpful. These things do offer support, ABA less so, but generally support and skills that help autistic folks navigate a world that is fundamentally inaccessible to us. And I would love if the entire world could sort itself out and be more accessible to us so that the onus of figuring out how to survive it did not sit on the shoulders of us disabled folks who are already tired and overworked solely from dealing with our unruly body minds. But lovingly, with all the hope and optimism in my heart, this is not happening in my lifetime, nor will it in the next 2 lifetimes probably. There is also the race aspect to factor in here, in that I, as a white femme presenting autistic, can have a meltdown in public and people will take care of me or just leave me be. Meanwhile, an autistic man of color may get killed for the same behavior. So saying all social skills therapy is bad is a deeply privileged and unnuanced take. But that acknowledged, social skills therapy and similar therapies have a primary focus on you can't socialize, we're gonna teach you how, rather than you socialize differently, here are tools to help you socialize with all the different kinds of people in the world. And they also have serious issues around consent. Yes, we should encourage folks to step out of their comfort zones and try new things and stretch themselves. I would not be where I am today if I had not had specific people in my life giving me little pushes out of the nest. But I also know that while maybe a third of these pushes were helpful, the other 2/3 were stressful and traumatizing, and people refused to take my no, I'm not comfortable with that as an answer, and that has screwed me up as a person. And it's hard to know when somebody is freezing up because they need a little bit of a push, or whether that push is forcing them to conform and is overall deeply traumatizing to them and removes their feeling of autonomy or validity about how they feel. And the fact that so much of the autistic representation that we get in the media is centered around therapeutic and medical settings where we continuously see forcing autistics way too far out of their comfort zones as the right thing to do really concerns me. In addition to the, can we please talk about autism outside of a medical or therapeutic setting in general, because there's so much more to it than that, but like, consent. I'm concerned about consent. And in this case, it was based on documentary, so I understand why they could not change that aspect of it, but whoever makes our next show involving autism, I would love if we could avoid medicalization as much as humanly possible. Honestly, the messaging of the rest of the show did this fairly well in trying to deliberately demedicalize this, which made the tone feel a little bit disjointed, but that comes from the fact that there are fundamental clashes between the narratives the medical view represents and the narratives that the non-medical view represents. Most of it stemming from the thin line that representation has to walk between these people are just like us and these people are different and that's okay, which is always really tricky and definitely popped up for me as the core issue of the narrative uncertainty of Ohio. But looking back at the therapy of it all, a lot of the reviews were frustrated that Dr. Amigo maybe isn't the most likable character, that he's a bit overbearing, that he meddles too much, that he pushes too far, that he forces them to conform to outdated ideals, and that he's really bad at reading others' emotions, which makes him a terrible father to Ashley. This is one of my favorite parts of the show. Because if you've grown up in the medical system or with a lot of medical people, this is what it looks like more often than not, for all the reasons we just discussed about the trickiness of social skills therapy, and also the whole, I went to school to study emotions, so therefore I understand everybody's emotions all the time and I cannot be wrong hubris thing that backfires the majority of the time for a lot of medical professionals. I get that people wanted to see a universally likable doctor with all his quirky autistic clients, but I really appreciated that the team made him messy and complicated and imperfect and made the audience feel kind of uncomfortable and also unsure how effective he may be as a doctor, because welcome to the world of disability care. Honestly, he was pretty fine in comparison to a lot of stories I've heard from my peers and also my own life. I also saw one review talking about how Dr. Amigo is gay in real life and having him straight in the show is erasure. I asked about that. Amigo was not out to the majority of people when the show was initially written, so that's why in the nightclub scene, the reporter says, I'm sure the right person is out there for you. They said person rather than woman to kind of point to the fact that his next partner may not be a woman, so not erasure, just how the cookie crumbled. The actual Amigo is super cool with it. He loves the show, so we're fine. The last thing before we talk about the source material is I want to discuss the adult aspect of the show. The amount of people referring to autistic adults as teenagers or kids was infuriating to me. Yes, technically a few of the characters are teenagers in that they're like 17, 18, 19, but they're all young adults. To be more specific, by character, I asked about this. Remy is 16-ish, that's not specified in the script. Jessica's in her early 20s, Caroline is 19, Drew is 18, Tommy's in his early 20s, Mel is 24, and Meredith is somewhere between Remy and Drew in age, so 17-ish probably. It is stated clearly in the show that they are definitively not kids. I can't really tell if they're infantilized in the show or if everybody just projected that onto them because society's firmly convinced that autism is a thing only kids have and autistic adults aren't real. And also the discussion of infantilization in autism is a very tricky one because a large part of it is the fact that we associate many autistic traits with children or see them as childlike behaviors in general. So a lot of the, oh, they're being portrayed as infantilized things are just them being them and people deciding to not see that as adult behavior. And also there's the added knowledge that most people over the age of 30, so the majority of the people who reviewed the show see anybody under the age of 25 as being a child, no matter what you do. They did try to deliberately combat some elements of cutesiness, especially with Caroline, by having her regularly talk about her special interests of guillotines and death, as you do. But there's not a lot, if people want to see them as cute, they're going to see them as cute no matter what you do. I think tying back to what I said earlier about having more complicated representation would have been cool. I do think the characters were very desexualized, which again adds to a level of cutesiness and infantilization. And I don't think having desexualized autistics is an issue in that a lot of autistics are asexual. We don't really see romantic relationships in the show anyway. It's also clear that this particular group of autistic adults does not really love touch, but like, I've also been described that way and I can go weeks without touching anybody and be fine, but then when I find somebody I'm comfy around who knows how to give good deep pressure hugs, I become a koala bear, so I don't think that's necessarily a roadblock. But given the fact that audiences were coming into this thinking autistic kids, and then the relationships we do get are Caroline constantly talking about her boyfriend who sucks and never mentioning so much as like a handhold or a hug, Jessica crushing on Tommy, but then that never majorly going anywhere, and Drew and Meredith freaking out over a crush over each other the entire time that ends in them dancing together with all the romantic intimacy of a middle school dance. I don't think that necessarily helped their case at making the audience reframe these people as adults who do adult things. Even a simple, like, forehead kiss between Meredith and Drew would have been great. I get that the point is for the show to end on the initial physical contact between the two of them because it's about the taking of the first step towards something new, but I still wanted a little bit more there. I also would have loved to see Caroline navigate the unhealthiness of her relationship a bit more because autistic people are much more likely, and disabled people in general, are much more likely to end up in abusive relationships for a multitude of reasons, and I feel like they had the opportunity to flesh that out and talk about the stickiness of that, and then they didn't. I mean, even the weird yet adorable romance in Waitress between Dawn and Ogie showed more intimate autistic relationship than what we got here, and I would have loved to see more of that in this show. Like, Tommy and Jessica would have been the perfect Dawn and Ogie moment, and I wanted to see that. I also think that having the two couples of the show that we see be the cishet white characters, and having one character of color having an offstage boyfriend and then the two queer characters of color being single was a choice that I did not love, and it read to me a little bit like it was for audience palatability purposes. I think down the line, a gender-bent Drew would be really great. I've heard one of the Drew covers on Broadway right now is non-binary and a person of color, and all the covers for the autistic women are BIPOC as well, so awesome, let's have more of that. I would also love some higher support needs folks in the show. Many of the characters could use an AAC device without it changing anything. But let's talk about the source material for a second because that puts everything into so much perspective for me. The original How to Dance in Ohio documentary was released in 2015, and it feels distinctly like representation from 2005, maybe 2008 at the latest. I know that some parts of America are going to be less up to date on things than others. A lot of the out of date stuff in the documentary I still see today in some almost exclusively medical places, but oh man was this hard to get through. I love how it showed the realistic day-to-day life of the autistic folks. I loved that it had people of all ages. I loved how it decentered the caregivers as much as possible and focused more on the autistic people. I also did not pick up that Ashley was Amigo's daughter in the documentary. I thought she was just another random person. If anything, that tells you a lot about how decentered they are in the narrative. Also, the whole journalist thing is not there. Most of the interesting plot points of the show are not in the documentary, but a few lines in the show do come straight from the doc, such as "we like to socialize, we don't know how." Oh, I also want to pause for a second. This is not in my script, but it was something I noticed while watching the film, and I would love to know your thoughts on it. All of the autistic folks in the documentary, or most of them, use the word panicky fairly regularly. And I was realizing that I have never heard the word panicky used outside of a deliberately autistic context, and that I added that word to my vocabulary after reading Curious Incident for the first time, and I've started saying it more recently because I studied Curious for a year, and I'm just wondering if anybody else has heard it outside of an autistic setting, and if that, I think that word as a commonly spoken about thing in our community comes from Curious Incident, which I think is just linguistically fascinating. Anyway, back to the documentary. There were puzzle pieces and Autism Speaks paraphernalia everywhere. There were quotes such as "individuals living with autism," "adults on the higher functioning end of the autism spectrum," somebody saying autism is easier when you're a kid, somebody saying that for autistic adults, tasks like making friends can be crippling, which is definitely a word choice, and an interaction where one person says, "I don't like touching other people," and Amigo responds, "Well, we're gonna break you of that." Like a horse? Breaking like a horse. I get that this is from 8 years ago, so it's going to be outdated, but from a historical context, Curious Incident was open on Broadway at this time, and that show may have its issues. Don't get me started, but also the creative team of Curious were not medical professionals who should be reading up-to-date research on autism, and they were also about 5 years ahead of this documentary in representation. We knew at this point that Autism Speaks was a eugenicist hate organization. That was well known. The DSM-5 had already been out for 2 years, which combined the Asperger's and autism diagnoses and did away with functioning labels, and I was beginning to seek out my own diagnosis, which would take me about 5 years to actually get, but that's beside the point. I've seen more outdated disability representation in the media during this time and also later, but the fact that Amigo is a medical professional actively working in the field and this film is this out of date is, I don't think concerning is the right word, but I am a bit frustrated that after seeing this lovely musical, people are going to go back and watch the documentary and think that the documentary is okay. And since the musical is based on it and therefore has to somewhat advertise it, they're getting the idea that it is co-signed by this show and all of the wonderful, amazing autistic advocates that come along with it, which no, it is actively not. Which brings us into the audience response to the show. But I'm actually going to pause for a hot second and talk about accessibility because that is such an important part of the show. They put so much work into it and I want to make sure I don't forget to highlight it. If you want my full access review of this show, I have linked it below for you. Basically, they've done as much as possible to try to make this show accessible for people, including having sensory bags that you can borrow that have sunglasses, headphones, an AAC card, and 3 fidget toys. When you buy your ticket, they email you beforehand with a blueprint of the place, which is also printed in the playbill so you know where things are. They're working on a visual social story where things are and what to expect with photos, like the one that we made for Curious Incident that will be available soon. There's also a sensory advisory guide that's kind of similar to my Access reviews linked on their website. They have 2 cool-down sensory spaces in the building, all the Access stuff that we usually see from Schubert theaters, like closed captioning, assistive listening, loop receivers, and audio description devices. They also have these adaptable sound adjustable headphones you can wear that put the audio of the show through them, and you can adjust the volume for yourself, which is really cool. I didn't try one, so I can't tell you how effective they are, but I've heard great things. And they also sell fidget spinners as merch, which are weighted and really cool, and I'm kind of obsessed with mine. I'm currently playing with it as I record this video because I can't get through a video without fidgeting. I will say that I did not find the lighting or set design of this show to be entirely accessible. I would give it a 4 out of 5 on my Access scale, 5 being Parade, 4 being Hadestown and Wicked. I know that they're trying to fix a handful of things, like making the streamers at the end move less and potentially matting the shiny things on the giant shiny ball thing at the end, so it's less reflective, but otherwise the set and lighting design are frozen. When Broadway opens a show, it becomes frozen, which means it can't be changed anymore, so there's not much that can be done about it now. There are a handful of things that are apparently being adjusted, so there might be some slight changes, but like major lighting cues are not going to be changed. I'm going to be honest, I was a little bit disappointed that it wasn't entirely accessibly staged, especially because the website previously talked about how the show was inherently sensory friendly, so I was expecting that to be the case, and then it wasn't. But in general, it's important to note that no matter what, full integrative access within the theater or any space is impossible because blanket access does not exist. Most things that are accessible for one person are inaccessible to another, and clashes between access needs happen literally all the time. So I did not expect the show to be fully accessible because that is not a thing that exists. I think the focus was primarily on autism access rather than overarching disability access, but I know that we nearly fell into that mindset with Curious a few times because we were so focused on neurodivergence, so I do understand why. And I will also add that trying to change access within inherently inaccessible structures and institutions where every time you ask for something basic you have to fight for it to get approved makes it really hard to get things done. I think the lighting and set issues could have been mitigated. I know they only had so much time and fixed a whole ton of things in that time, so what we have is what there wasn't time to fix. And also the in-house access options are beyond amazing for what they had to work with. I will also say that after finding the language on the website saying it was fully accessible and going, no, I emailed them about it and they were wonderful and kind, and they have been actively currently working to change things and are willing to learn and change things, which are so many extra bonus points to them, and I really, really appreciate them for like being willing to learn and change stuff and, you know, do the best that they can. It's very, very admirable, and I just wanted to note that. Access also exists there outside of disability. They have been working really hard to make the show price accessible for folks as well, and there will be specific sensory-friendly performances of the show. I'm unclear if by sensory-friendly that means the equivalent of a relaxed performance, as they're called in the UK, which focuses on overall accessibility and relaxed social norms rather than just autism and sensory needs. I think that's the case. That's the vibes I'm getting. But I'm not 100% on that. One of my goals in the next year is to go to a sensory-friendly performance on Broadway for journalistic purposes and teach y'all about what it's actually like from a first-person perspective. So maybe I'll end up at one of the ones for the show. We'll see, but that's the thing that's gonna come at some point, hopefully. Also, if any access questions about the show come up for you, feel free to drop them into the comments. I can direct folks on the team to your comment and they will respond and give you answers. That's already been happening on my Instagram, so it can happen on here as well. I will also add that there are some access things within the show for both the actors and the audience that are coming up in reviews as things people are complaining about, which really further points to the wider discussion that most of the reviewers did not know what the show was or how to handle it, with the exception of the handful of neurodivergent reviewers who knew what was up. I think there were only like 4 or 5 of us. There should have been more. For example, all of the autistic characters wear the same thing every single time that we see them except for the dance and one other song. This is to deliberately help face-blind folks keep track of them. The dancing and movement in the show are deliberately not super complicated, so the cast of disabled people can consistently, sustainably do it 8 times a week without exploding. Most of the songs are not super belty, complicated, difficult, but instead lean into subtler beauty and tonality for the same reason. And that's actually a really great transition into the reviews for this show. I read every single review I could get my hands on for journalistic integrity purposes. I think I read about 18 or 20. Nearly every single one of them had at least 2 microaggressions in it. The dream. It was great. My personal 2 favorites, one of which I will call out by name, the other of which I will not, and you will see why. The first one was the queerty one, where they said one of the characters identifies as they, them, which is not a thing, and then said How to Dance in Ohio tears down ableist cliches and reminds audiences that the core symptoms of autism vary among individuals, and cited Autism Speaks symptoms list as its sources. I don't understand how a queer publication managed to screw up talking about queer people so terribly, and then Autism Speaks? You should literally saying they're breaking down ableism. Anyway, here's a hate group that wants autistic people to not exist anymore. How? How did that happen? Several reviews also blatantly misspelled people's names, which was gorgeous. We had a lot of neurodivergent used as a placeholder for autism because they were afraid to use the word. Most of the reviews referred to Remy using exclusively he, him, despite Remy using any pronouns, which is not technically incorrect, but given the way the reviewers talk about minority identity in general, felt more like they were deliberately avoiding the concept of having to use they, them pronouns for anyone other than Mel because they had no choice to use them for Mel, which was really great. My second favorite review was one where the guy was clearly annoyed by this show and was continuously talking about how he somewhat related to the characters but somewhat didn't, and he seemed annoyed that it was a big deal that they were on Broadway, and was also wildly off base with most of the things he took away from the show. And it is so clear for me that this man is minutes away from discovering something about himself but really doesn't want to have to think about it too hard. It was great. It read like a conversation I've had with many professors who refuse to give me accommodations because that would require them realizing that maybe they also need accommodations and might actually be autistic. It was beautiful. I wish him the best. The last thing that came up in reviews was, we wish we'd seen more autistic struggles. That thing came up a lot. And I somewhat actually agree with a section of the sentiment, as we talked about earlier with the whole, like, I wish there was more depth and messiness in these autistic characters. But a lot of the desire to see autistic struggles for a lot of people is for inspiration-corn reasons and for trauma-corn reasons alone, because they want to see disabled suffering, and they assume that they are going to see disabled suffering and that they are somewhat owed that narrative because that's what we usually get from disabled representation. In the same way that straight people get annoyed when stories about queer people don't include homophobic family members or a sob coming out story. To quote Nicole D'Angelo's story from the other day, this musical intentionally subverts trauma porn by assigning distressing aspects of autism, meltdowns, outbursts, social missteps, and misunderstanding to the neurotypical characters, making way for autistic joy. And along with accessibility for the actors, portraying autistic distress such as meltdowns and whatnot on stage can be very triggering for disabled audience members and absolutely draining for the actors, because pretending to have a panic attack and your body going, oh, we're having a panic attack now, let's just do it, happens a lot. So any scenes of distress for the characters were deliberately somewhat shortened, or in Remy's case, in a song where the body is less likely to process it as, oh, we're having a panic attack now because it's a song, and it feels less painfully realistic for everybody involved. I think this did slightly rob some depth from the characters. I think they could have played with this concept a little bit more, but this is also the first time I've ever seen deliberate attention paid to the length of time actors are showing distress so as not to overwhelm them. So this is uncharted territory and therefore went pretty well given the fact that it's new. I just want to see how that expands in further shows down the line. The thing that is most important to note that I don't think I saw any of the reviews other than my own cover, even though it is the thing that I've been asked about with every single disabled person who's talked to me about the show, is the audience's response to it. For the sake of not having to reword the same thing twice, I'm gonna just use a slightly edited version from my earliest iteration of my 3 views review here, so if it sounds weirdly familiar, that's why I'm plagiarizing myself. But throughout the show, I heard a lot of people around me talk about how cute the autistic adults were and how they were very high functioning and doing a great job. And I also watched them cheer and clap when the parents on stage sang about how they never expected to see their kids hit a certain milestone, and watched their over-the-top cheering reaction to an autistic person dumping their boyfriend, which did not deserve that level of cheering at all. Like, was it a lot of autistic people being excited for a peer, in which case that would be a reasonable response? Or was it allistic folks going, oh, this autistic young adult does such a good job breaking up with the boy who is terrible, we're so proud, because that's what it felt like. The beautifully written ableist moment in Act 2, which I saw some reviews talking about how inaccurate or over the top it was, please know that it takes heavy inspiration from a real article that does exist, and also I have seen worse in my time in this field. This is very realistic. Also, a few reviewers were talking about how they took the easy route of using journalists as a scapegoat without realizing that the primary concern of the show for everybody since day one was how it would be publicized and discussed. So it was a deliberate choice to point to the genuine fears our community has about journalists with this show and not playing into some stereotype or cliche. Anyway, sidetrack, sorry. The words used in this article are all ones people think are compliments about disabled people, but are in fact incredibly patronizing and disgusting. I could literally feel the people around me pause, learn, go, maybe what I said as a compliment during intermission was not a good thing to say. And I heard their language shift when they discussed things after the show, which was wonderful and amazing. But the thing that has stuck with me most about seeing the show was how the audience responded to me. When I consume autistic media representation, I often get very overwhelmed. This is common for many autistic people. It makes me hyper aware of how much I mask and how exhausting that is. I lose all desire to keep doing it. I get more emotionally involved in the plot than I typically do because I feel a closer kinship to the characters. And also, as an analyst and historian, I'm always expecting something to go wrong because something always goes wrong. Now, as a result, I often seem more autistic in that you will see me stim more, struggle more with organic speech, and often will generally move differently than I typically do. I was once told that I needed to stop watching autistic representation because it was making me regress, so I try to avoid consuming it around others if I can help it. That's a thing that I'm working on unpacking. It's fine. Any of my friends can tell you that when I make disability media reviews into movie nights, it's always the disability ones, and I do the autistic stuff on my own in my room, door closed. Just consistently, always what I do. Obviously, in this case, I couldn't do that. That was not an option. And add to that the added anxiety of seeing this show specifically. So I was a stimmy, shaky mess who had a hard time putting words together, and it was an experience. It was great. The whole audience got to see that, and I'm so sorry to anybody who ran into me in that theater. But during intermission and after the show, as I walked around the theater, I expected to be generally ignored or given the quick, like, awkward glance, look away thing that happens when I stim in public. I'm used to it, whatever. Instead, the people around me were staring at me. Not in a judgmental way, but in like a disbelief. They'd come across a unicorn in the wild. They did not expect to see somebody who was autistic existing off of the stage. I was only allowed to exist on the stage, but I was in real life. What? No, terrible. And since they just spent a few hours staring at autistic people being visibly autistic in a socially acceptable way, they assumed that it was therefore socially acceptable to stare at me the same way they were staring at the characters on the stage. And it was very clear to me that they felt as if somebody like me is only palatable and comfortable to be around from a careful distance where the interplay between somebody like me and somebody like them is clearly delineated with no actual direct interaction between the two. That has been my primary concern with this show. People in this industry are now patting themselves on the back that they understand autism now and they're comfortable around autism now because they saw 7 of us on stage, but then when they see one of us in the audition room, they're not going to see us as actors and frankly as people. We will just be another one of the Ohio characters that they get to stare at for their own enjoyment and make themselves feel better. And I don't think there was a ton this show could do to try to change that fact. The way they educated, especially in the Act 2 moment, was excellent, but at the end of the day, people were going to get out of the show what they put into it. And if they wanted to see inspiration corn, they would have seen inspiration corn either way. And they did. And part of me selfishly wishes that they had leaned entirely into your traditional Broadway staging to at least prove that people like me can do 8 shows a week of dancing and belting our faces off to try to get mainstreamed faster. But I also appreciate their focus on the safety and well-being of their actors and willingness to show that the current Broadway model isn't accessible and isn't sustainable for anybody, and good shows can be made outside of it. And I know that all of the accessibility changes in the show were a bit of a logistical nightmare to sort out, and I want to extra appreciate and highlight those. I wish I could tell you I think they're going to be carried across to other shows, but I am unfortunately very sure that that will not be the case. But at the end of the day, How to Dance in Ohio is a great show. It is the precise first step that we need in this industry, and I hope that it starts a lot of conversations like this one about how we can build on this foundation. I'm talking more sensual representation, representation that just is without explanation, representation that lets us be complicated adults in complicated relationships, more queer disabled representation, higher support needs representation, having people like me mainstreamed in all other shows that rely on autistic coded characters for their narratives to be effective, having people like me mainstreamed in non-autistic coded roles, because literally why not? We spend our whole lives trying to learn how to act like neurotypicals, so if anything, we're going to be better at it than anybody else. Also, having accessibility be more consistent across the board. And also, heads up to non-disabled actors and people in the performance industry who want to help out and don't know how. You can write specific access requirements into your contracts to help your disabled colleagues and audience members. You can write in there that you require that any show that you're in includes one ASL interpreted performance. You can include that it doesn't include any strobe lights. You can add that into your contract. You can advocate for accessibility so that your preemptively exhausted disabled colleagues don't have to do that because we're already struggling more. So if you want to help us out, do that. Throw that into your contracts, please, I beg of you. But anyway, I am concerned, and I have been for several years, that people are looking at Ohio uncritically and thinking that we have checked the box and solved the problem in the industry, just like what happened with Deaf West Spring Awakening in 2015. This show was gonna have issues. It was going to be crunchy and messy in its delivery because it's the first of its kind. Curious got canceled before y'all got to see how messy and crunchy our show was. You can probably tell that based on the documentary, actually, but still, a lot of the critiques of Ohio carry across to what we did with Curious as well. Working within systems not built for you is hard. Creating something that has never been done before is hard. hard, but somebody needs to do it so we can get to what's next. So we can break through barriers, so we can start conversations and make it easier for those who come after us. And let me tell you, the pressure and the anxiety of that is enough to make somebody want to not try at all. Believe me, I lived it. I don't think I'm gonna do it again. So the fact that the final product is this good is an even bigger feat than people realize. It has issues, sure. Some of the things I feel like maybe we know better than that now, but overall they did the best that they could with what they had, and they did a pretty darn good job of it. So in conclusion, not perfect, but representation never is, and that is only fixed by having an abundance of it, which we simply do not right now, which means that you, all my creative, autistic, and/or disabled viewers, you better get to work. In the meantime, thank you for listening, thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over. If you need me in the next few months, I will be happily crying somewhere in the Blasco, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.